The town laughed when she handed over $2 silver for a building no one else would touch, boarded windows, a door swollen shut for years, a floor stained with something that would not scrub away. They called her a fool. They told her there was nothing inside but dust and other men's ghosts. But on a night when the wind leaned hard against the walls, a girl alone with a lantern set her knuckles against the brick, and the wall answered back. Hollow. One section, wrong color, wrong sound, a patch that bulged where it had no reason to bulge. She raised the hammer, because some doors are shut to keep trouble out, and some are shut to keep a truth buried in the dark. She was about to learn which kind this was, and nothing in that quiet town would stay buried much longer. There is a kind of quiet that settles over a town at the end of a long road, the kind that has weight to it, the kind that presses against a person's shoulders before they have so much as stepped down from the coach. That was the quiet that met the girl when she arrived. She was 19, thin in the way that comes from skipped meals rather than from youth. Her dress was the color of dust, because the road had made it so, and her hands held tight to a single carpet bag that carried everything she had left in the world, which was to say, not much. The coach driver did not help her down. He simply waited, chewing on something, until she had both feet on the boards of the street. Then he snapped the reins and was gone, and the dust his wheels kicked up hung in the air long after the sound of them had faded into the hills. She stood there in the middle of it, a girl in a strange town. No one to meet her, no place that wanted her. Her name was Della Hart, and she had come a very long way to stand in a place that did not care whether she lived or died. The town was small, the kind of small where every face knew every other face, and a stranger was counted before she had taken her third step down the street. False-fronted buildings leaned against one another along its length, their paint blistered and peeling from years of hard sun. A blacksmith's hammer rang somewhere off to the left, steady as a slow heartbeat. A dog crossed the road without any hurry at all, as though it had nowhere in particular to be, and all the time in the world to get there. And the people looked at her the way folks look at weather they would rather not have. A woman outside the general store paused with a basket balanced on her hip. Two men leaning against a hitching rail let their eyes drift over her, slow, taking her measure and finding her wanting. No one smiled. No one called out a greeting. They simply watched and then turned back to whatever had been occupying them, because a thin girl with one bag and trail dust on her hem was not worth the trouble of a kind word. Della had grown used to that look. She had been wearing other people's judgment like a second coat for a good long while now. A week before, or near enough, she had been turned out of the place where she worked, a ranch some miles back along the road she had just traveled. The man who owned it had a soft voice and hard intentions, and when she would not give him what he wanted, he had given her what he wanted her to have instead. The door, the long walk down the lane to the road, his wife watching from a window with a face like a closed fist, as though the whole sorry business had been Della's doing and not her own husband's. So she had taken the road. She always seemed to be taking the road. For a year she had worked that ranch from dark to dark. She had saved every spare coin, hidden them away in a sock at the bottom of her trunk, and dreamed a small and stubborn dream. A piece of land someday. A patch of the earth that could not be taken from her. A place to set down her bag and stay. Now those saved coins felt impossibly few. A small, thin handful held up against a country that stretched out wide and uncaring in every direction. But there was a deeper loss in her than coins, one that had shaped the whole of her young life. Her father, Samuel Hart, a quiet man, a man who smelled of pine and cold stone and pipe smoke, a man who used to sit on the step of whatever rough place they were renting and carve small things from scraps of wood, just to keep his hands busy while he turned a thought over in his mind. He had gone into the ground 5 years before. A mine, out past the edge of some town much like this one. The earth had come down, and it had kept him. That was the story she had been told. A cave-in, an accident, bad luck, and worse timing. The way the country took men sometimes and gave nothing back. His leaving had set her adrift. A grief so steady, so constant, that it had become a part of her breathing. Something she carried in and out of her chest with every breath she took, until she could scarcely remember what it had felt like to breathe without it. And the last words she had from him were folded into the bottom of her carpet bag. A letter, soft now and worn thin at the creases, from being opened and read and opened again. A letter full of hope. He had written of a claim, of something good that was coming, of how he would send for her once it was all settled, and how the two of them would have a place at last. A real place. A home. The letter had come from this town, so she had come to this town, not because she believed she would find him here. The ground does not give back what it takes. She knew that better than she knew almost anything. She had come because this was the last place he had stood while still believing in something good. The last place he had been whole. And to be near that, to breathe the same dry air he had breathed when he still had a future in front of him, felt like the nearest thing to comfort she could afford. It was a pilgrimage of a kind, a daughter walking toward the last warm footprint her father had left in a cold world. She found a room above a quiet boarding house run by a stern-faced woman who asked no questions so long as the rent was laid down in advance. Della paid for 2 nights with coins she could ill afford to spend, and then she walked. For 2 days she walked the town slowly, the way her father had taught her to walk new ground, listening more than she looked, looking more than she spoke. And the town, in its careless way, began to give up its shape to her. There was a name people said in low and careful voices, Brennan, the Marshal. They said it the way folks say the name of a man who decides things, a man whose goodwill is worth the keeping, and whose ill will is a thing to be feared. She saw men with money weighing down their pockets, and a certain swagger weighing down their step, men who seemed to belong to the big mining outfit that sat over the whole valley like a wide and heavy hand. And then, at the ragged edge of the respectable part of town, she saw the building. It sat between a blacksmith shop and an empty lot, hunched and sagging, like a thing ashamed of itself, a saloon. Or it had been one, in some other time. The windows were boarded over with gray, weathered planks. The door wore a notice nailed crooked across it, the paper gone yellow and curling at the corners. A faded sign hung from a single rusted hinge above the door, and the wind moved it just enough to make it creak. A thin, lonely sound, like a question that no one cared to answer. The townsfolk gave the place a wide berth. She watched them do it. A man crossing the street would drift a little farther out as he came abreast of it. A woman would let her gaze slide away from it, the way water slides off oiled cloth, as though the building carried some sickness a person might catch just by looking at it too long. Whatever that place was, it frightened them. And Della, cast out, dust-covered, carrying a grief she had no place to set down, felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt kinship. Here was a thing the town had decided was worthless, a thing it had boarded up and turned its back on, a thing the whole town had agreed, quietly and together, to forget. She knew exactly how that felt. She asked about it at the land office. The young man behind the counter had ink staining his fingers and a smirk that came easy to him. He did not trouble himself to look up at first. When she asked about the boarded-up saloon at the edge of town, he gave a short laugh through his nose, the way a person laughs at a thing too foolish to take seriously. "That place," he said, as though the words had a bad taste to them. "Been shut for years now. The marshal closed it down himself. There was trouble in there. Bad trouble. The old owner and some drifter went at each other over a card game, and the both of them ended up dead on the floor." He shrugged. "Floorboards are stained with it, they say. Couldn't scrub it out, no matter how they tried." He leaned back in his chair. "It's condemned. The town holds it now, for back taxes that nobody is ever like to pay." Della was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the question that would turn the whole course of her life, though she could not have known it then. "Is it for sale?" The young man finally lifted his eyes to her, and then he laughed. Truly laughed. The way a man laughs at a joke that has fallen into his lap unasked for on an otherwise dull afternoon. "For sale?" He shook his head slowly. "Miss, the town would pay you to haul it off. There is not a soul who wants that place." He was enjoying himself now. "Tell you what, though, the back taxes on it come to $2. You want it so badly, it is yours for $2, even, and you would be the biggest fool this side of the mountains for the buying of it." $2. It was meant as a cruelty, a small, easy cruelty, the kind that men hand out when they are bored and a defenseless girl has wandered into range. $2 was the price of a thing so worthless that it could be insulted with a number. But Della Hart had learned something in 19 hard years. She had learned that the things other people throw away are sometimes the very things worth the keeping. And she had learned that a girl who has lost nearly everything has little left to lose by reaching for the thing that no one else will so much as touch. She reached into the small purse at her wrist. Her fingers found the coins, so few of them left now, and she set $2 silver down upon the counter, side by side, with a small, clear sound that seemed very loud in the stillness of that office. The smirk slid right off the young man's face. "You are serious," he said. It was not a question. He could see plainly that she was. "I am," she said. He stared at her a moment longer, waiting, perhaps, for her to laugh and take it back, to admit she had only been fooling. She did no such thing. She held his gaze, steady and clear, until he was the one obliged to look away. He drew up the deed with a sour flourish. His pen scratched loudly across the paper, the lone sound in the room. And when he pushed the document across the counter to her, he shook his head, one slow time. "Good luck to you," he said. "You are going to need every scrap of it." She folded the deed once and then again, and tucked it down deep into her bag, into the soft, dark place where her father's letter lay waiting. And when she stepped back out into the hard, bright light of the street, she felt something stir in her chest that had lain still for 5 long years. It was small, so small that she nearly failed to know it for what it was, but it was there. The faint and fragile beginning of a future. She owned something now, a broken, blood-stained, forgotten something. But it was hers, and it could not be taken from her by a man with a soft voice, or a wife with a hard face, or a whole town that had already made up its mind that she did not matter. It was hers. The whispers followed her down the plank sidewalk like stray dogs trailing at her heels. She could not make out all the words, but she could feel them, the way a person feels a draft from a door left open somewhere behind her back. A woman murmured behind her hand outside the general store. "Bought the old place, they say. That little thing. All by her lonesome." A man on the corner shifted a wad of tobacco from one cheek to the other and spat into the dust at his feet. "More fool her. That place is nothing but bad luck and worse men." Della kept walking. She let the whispers fall away behind her, the way she had learned to let so very many things fall away. They were only noise, no different from the wind that came down off the high ground in the late afternoon and rattled every loose board in town. A person did not argue with the wind. A person simply bent her head and held to her course and kept walking. She spent some of her last coins at the hardware store, a pry bar, heavy and cold and certain in her hand, a bucket, a bar of hard soap, practical things, things with weight to them, things a person could put her hands around and trust. Then she walked to the edge of town, to the building that was hers now, and she stood before its boarded door. The notice nailed across it was brittle as a dead leaf. She took hold of it and pulled, and it came away in pieces, crumbling between her fingers and scattering down into the dirt. The door beneath was swollen tight in its frame, the wood gone fat with years of damp and neglect. She set her shoulder to it, pushed. Nothing gave. She planted her feet, drew a breath, and put the whole of her small weight against it, and still the door held, stubborn as a shut mouth. She was reaching for the pry bar when a voice spoke behind her. A dry voice, soft, but it carried. The kind of voice that has watched a great deal and chosen to say very little of it. "That door has stayed shut a long while," the voice said. "It has near forgotten how a door is meant to open." Della turned. An old woman sat in the shade beneath the blacksmith's awning, perched on an upturned crate, with a bundle of dried herbs gathered loosely in her lap. Her face was deeply lined, the way a dry creek bed is lined where the water has run through it season upon season. Her eyes were dark and steady, and they rested on Della with an attention the rest of the town had not troubled to offer her. The townsfolk seemed to move around the old woman without ever quite seeing her. A fixture, a part of the scenery they had long since stopped noticing. Della had passed her once or twice in her walking, and had felt, even then, that here was a person who saw a good deal more than she let show. Someone had spoken her name in passing. Hazel. Hazel looked from Della to the stubborn door, and back again to the girl. "Some doors are shut to keep trouble out," she said. Her voice was low and even, and there was no hurry anywhere in it. And some are shut to keep a thing quiet, to hold it down in the dark, where a person cannot look at it too closely. She held Della's gaze a moment longer than was comfortable. Something passed between the two of them in that look, something that had no words to carry it. Then the old woman let her eyes drop back to the herbs in her lap, and her gnarled hands took up their work again, and it was as though she had said all she had come to say. Della stood very still. The old woman's words moved through her like cold spring water. To hold a thing down in the dark. What could there be to keep buried in a place like this, other than the plain and ugly truth of a man dying badly upon its floor? That was an old story, a common one. The country was thick with such stories, and most of them were better left untold. And yet, she turned back to the door, but this time she did not shove at it like an enemy. This time she looked at it, the way her father would have looked at it, the way he had looked at a wall of rock before he ever laid a single tool against it, reading the grain of the thing, searching out the one place where it wished to give. She worked the tip of the pry bar into the narrow gap at the edge of the frame. She set her weight, and she leaned. The wood groaned. A long, low, mournful sound, like something waking from a sleep it had no wish to leave. And then, with a sharp, cracking pop, the door swung inward, into darkness. The air that came rushing out of that darkness was thick and stale, and it carried smells along with it. Sour whiskey gone over to vinegar, old dust, cold ash from a fire dead for years, and underneath the whole of it, faint and strange, a thin metallic tang she could not put a name to. It smelled, she thought, of regret. She stood upon the threshold with the bright day at her back and the black room laid out before her, and for one long moment she let herself wonder just what it was she had done. What madness had led her to trade her last few coins for a tomb? Was this only one more mistake in a long and crooked line of them? Was the whole laughing town right about her after all? But then, what other door had opened for her? What place in all her wandering had taken her in? This broken thing had cost her $2 and the small dignity of being laughed at. But it had not turned her away. It had not looked at her with a hard face and pointed her back toward the road. It had simply opened. So Della Hart drew a long, slow breath of that dusty, forgotten air, and she stepped across the threshold into the dark that was hers now. She did not return to the boarding house that night. She could not spare the coin for another night's rent, and more than that, she felt a need she could scarcely put into words, a need to be inside the thing she owned, to press her own living presence into it, to make it hers not by paper alone, but by the plain fact of being there when the dark came down over the town. She lit the lantern she had carried in, and the small flame pushed the blackness back a few feet, and no more than that. What it showed her was ruin, tables overturned, chairs broken and scattered across the floor like the bones of some long-dead animal. Glass crunched beneath her boots, the shards of bottles, the splinters of a great mirror that had once hung behind the bar and now hung only in pieces, its silvered face gone cloudy and blind. The bar itself was a wreckage of dark wood, long and heavy, scarred with knife marks and the pale rings of 1,000 forgotten glasses. A whole section of it was caved inward, splintered as though a body, or a fist driven by something close to rage, had gone clean through it. It was a place where even sound seemed to have come to die. She set her lantern down on a steadier stretch of the bar and laid out her bedroll in the cleanest corner she could find. It looked very small there. A thin little shape of a girl in a great and broken room. She ate a dry biscuit and drank from her canteen, and the silence of the place pressed in upon her from every side. Every creak of the old building settling sounded like a footstep on the stair. Every small scuttle of a mouse within the walls made her breath go still in her throat. It would have been an easy place in which to believe in ghosts. So she thought of her father instead. She tried to call up his face, the steady calm in his eyes, the soft lines at their corners when he came near to smiling. He had never been a man afraid of hard work, nor of dark places. He had spent the better half of his life underground, reading stories in the rock that other men walked straight past without a second glance. He would not have looked upon this ruin and seen a tomb. He would have looked upon it and seen a thing that was waiting to be set right. He would have started. She could very nearly hear him saying it. He would have started with a broom. So she did. She found a worn-down broom in a closet at the back, the straw of it brittle but holding still, and she began to sweep. The slow scrape and whisper of the bristles across the boards was a human sound, a living sound, and in all that great dead silence, it was a comfort beyond the telling of it. She swept from the back of the room toward the front. She made for herself a small, clean island of floorboards around her bedroll, a place that was hers within the place that was hers. The dust came up heavy and dark beneath her broom, full of old sawdust and the broken leavings of nights long gone to memory. And then, up near the front, close by the door, her foot scuffed against something set into the floor. She stopped. She knelt down low, and she brought the lantern close, and she brushed away the grime of years with the side of her hand. There, cut into the worn wood of the floorboard, rough and small and near hidden beneath the dirt, were two letters. S.H. Della's breath caught somewhere high in her chest and would not come loose. She told herself it meant nothing at all. Letters. Two letters. A great many names in this wide country began with such letters. It was a saloon. Men had sat here and drunk here and idled away slow hours here with knives in their idle hands. Any one of them might have cut his mark into a floorboard while waiting out a long afternoon. Any one of them. But her fingers were already moving over the carving, tracing it. The straight, deep cut of the S. The clean, square corner of the H. And she knew that cut. She knew the patient, particular way of it, the way she knew her own name. A memory rose up in her, sudden and sharp as the smell of pine. Her father on the step of some borrowed house, a scrap of wood held in one hand, and his pocket knife in the other, carving her own two letters into it just to watch the smile spread across her face, the same straight strokes, the same care taken, the same hand. The lantern light swam before her eyes. Her father had been here, not passed through, not glimpsed the place from the seat of a passing wagon. He had sat here, in this very spot, long enough and still enough to lean down and cut his own mark into the floor of it. But his letters to her had spoken of the mine, of the claim, of hard and honest work, and the hope of a home for the two of them. They had spoken of stone and sweat and the future he was building with his own two hands. They had said nothing, not one single word, of saloons, of card tables, of a place such as this one. It did not fit the man she had known. She sat back slowly on her heels, the lantern trembling just a little in her grip, its light moving across those two rough letters cut into the floor of a place her father had no good reason to be, and the building, the broken, laughed at, $2 building she had bought out of grief and stubbornness and the plain human need to own one single thing in all the world, was no longer only a building. It was a thread, a thin and fraying thread, reaching back through 5 years of silence and sorrow, back toward a man she had buried in her own heart without ever once standing at his grave. He had been here. He had sat right here, where she was kneeling now. And somewhere within the dark of this place, behind its boarded windows and its blood-stained boards, there lay a reason that he had chosen to tell her nothing of it. Della pressed her palm flat against the carving, the way a person rests a hand upon a shoulder she can no longer reach. "What were you doing here?" she whispered into the dark. The lantern flame leaned and steadied and went on burning low, and the old saloon held to its silence, the way it had held to its silence for 5 long years, waiting, it may be, for someone with the stubbornness to ask the question, and the patience to stay until it answered. The morning came in pale and slow, the way mornings do when a person has slept little and dreamed less. Della woke on the floor of the place she now owned, with the carved letters cold beneath her open hand, just where she had left it in the night. S.H. In the gray light, the 2 letters looked smaller than they had by lantern flame, but they had lost none of their weight. If anything, the daylight made them harder to argue with. Her father had been here, and that single fact had changed everything. The work she had begun the night before, the sweeping, the clearing, the small stubborn task of making one corner of a ruin livable, was no longer only that. It had become something else. It had become a search. Each broom stroke now was a question. Each piece of broken chair she carried out into the alley, each shard of glass she swept into her bucket, was a way of asking the silent room, the thing that beat in her chest like a second pulse. What happened here? Why were you in this place, of all places? And what was it that you never told me? She worked through the early hours with a steadiness that surprised even her. Her hands, already rough from a year of ranch work, began to crack and blister. Her back ached low and deep. But the labor was a kind of medicine. It quieted the noise in her head and gave her something solid to hold to when so little else in her life had ever stayed put. She was hauling a load of splintered wood toward the front door when a shadow fell across the threshold. She looked up. A man stood there, filling the doorway, with the bright street behind him, so that for a moment he was only a shape, a big shape, broad through the shoulders and easy in the way he held himself, the way a man holds himself when he has rarely been told no. Then he stepped inside, and the light caught the badge pinned to his chest, and the pistol that sat low and ready on his hip. The Marshal Brennan. "Well now," he said. His voice was warm, too warm, The warmth of a man who has learned that a soft tone opens more doors than a hard one. Word around town was somebody finally bought the old place. I confess, I did not expect it to be a slip of a girl. Della set down her load of wood. She did not hurry. She straightened her back, and she met his eyes, and she said nothing at all. He smiled at that, as though her silence pleased him somehow. "It is a sorry old building," he went on, looking past her into the gloom of the room, his gaze moving slow across the ruin of it. "I shut it down myself, you know. Years back. There was a killing here. Maybe more than one." He shook his head with a sorrow that did not reach his eyes. "A place holds on to that kind of thing. Bad feeling. It soaks into the wood, into the walls." He took a step closer. "A girl such as yourself, you would be wise to walk away from it. Sell the paper back to the town. Take $1 for your trouble and put it behind you." He spread his big hands, the picture of a man offering kindness. "There is nothing here for you. Nothing at all." And it was there, in those last words, that Della heard it. The thing beneath the warmth, not concern. Concern does not press that hard. What lay under his soft voice was something closer to a hand closing around a thing it did not wish to let go. He was not worried for her. He was worried about the building. "I paid $2 for it," she said. Her voice came out even, betraying nothing of the cold thing turning over in her stomach. "I mean to get my money's worth." For just a moment, something flickered across the marshal's face, something that was not warmth and was not kindness, and was gone again before it could be named. Then he laughed, a big, easy laugh that he sent rolling out the open door for the whole street to hear. "Your money's worth," he repeated, as though it were the finest joke he had heard in a season. "Honey, all you bought is a pile of rotten wood and other men's ghosts." His eyes moved once more around the room, slow, searching, almost, though he would not have called it that. "You listen to me. There is nothing for you in there. In there, not in here, in there." The marshal lingered another long moment, the way a man lingers when he is waiting for a thing to break, waiting for the girl to lower her eyes, to falter, to take the easy road he had laid down so nicely for her. She did not. She simply bent and took up her load of wood again and turned for the door as though he were no more than a piece of furniture in her way. He stepped aside to let her pass, but at the threshold he paused and looked back at her once over his shoulder. "Do not say I never warned you," he said. And then he was gone, out into the morning, his boots ringing confident and unhurried on the boards of the street. The warning hung in the air behind him, heavier than the heat, heavier than the dust, because it was no friendly word. Della had heard friendly words, and she had heard the other kind, and she knew the difference in her bones. It was an order, dressed up in a soft voice and a wide smile. And a person does not order a girl away from a pile of rotten wood, unless there is something in that wood worth keeping her away from. She did not sleep much that night either. The marshal's words turned over and over in her mind, and they fit together, somehow, with the old woman's words from the day before, until the two of them made a single shape she could not yet see the whole of. Some are shut to keep a thing down in the dark. There is nothing for you in there. By the next morning, the search had a new direction. She had cleared most of the front of the room. Now she turned to the bar. The long, broken length of dark wood that sat at the heart of the place. The heart of the violence that had closed its doors. If there were answers anywhere, she reasoned, they would be near the center of it all. The bar was too heavy to move, so she set to clearing the wreckage behind it instead. She filled her bucket again and again with broken glass and splintered shelving and the rusted, unrecognizable bits of 100 forgotten nights. And it was there, working in the close space behind the bar, that she first noticed the wall. Most of the inside of the building was rough-hewn plank, gone gray with age, but the back wall, behind the bar, was made of brick. An old chimney climbed up at one end of it, dark with soot, and the brick was wrong. Not the whole of it, just one section, a patch of it, roughly behind the very center of the bar. The brick there was a slightly different shade, a touch newer, a little less worn by the years than the brick that surrounded it. The mortar between was paler too, a sandy color that stood out plain against the dark, soot-stained gray of the older joints all around it. It was a patch, a clumsy one, a hasty one, and it did not sit flush with the rest of the wall. It bulged, just barely, a shallow swell in what should have been a flat surface, so slight that a person might pass it a dozen times and never see it. Della ran her hand across it. The brick felt solid beneath her palm, cold, immovable. Now there was a plain and simple answer for such a thing. A repair. Damage from the brawl that had closed the place. A man thrown hard against the wall, a few bricks knocked loose and set back in by careless hands. That would explain it. That was the sensible thought. But it did not feel right. And Della had been taught, by a man who read stone for a living, to trust the thing that did not feel right. Her father used to say it to her on long evenings when he came up out of the ground tired and dusty. Look for the thing that is out of place, Della, the seam that does not match. That is where the earth keeps its secrets. A vein of good ore does not announce itself. It hides behind the part of the rock that looks just slightly wrong. This wall was a seam. She stepped back from it, and she looked at the whole of the patch, and the wrongness of it grew under her gaze rather than fading. It was too large, nearly the height of a tall man, near as wide as a doorway. What sort of repair calls for the re-bricking of so great a stretch of wall? She told herself she was letting the place get into her. The dark, the dust, the marshal's words, and the old woman's. She told herself she was a tired girl, seeing shapes in the shadows. But that evening, after a thin supper of biscuit and water, she did not lay out her bedroll. She took up the small hammer she had found in the back closet, and she crossed to the wall. She tapped one of the bricks at the center of the patch. A dull, flat thud answered her. Solid. Then she moved her hand a little and tapped a brick well outside the patch on the old part of the wall. And the sound was different, deeper, fuller, with a faint ring to it, the way a thick stone wall rings when there is solid earth packed close behind it. She went back to the patch and tapped again. Dull, hollow. She tapped the old brick, deep, solid. The patch. The old brick. The patch. Hollow. Solid. Hollow. A cold certainty settled into her stomach and would not be argued out of it. There was a space behind that patch of newer brick. An empty space. The patch was not a repair. It was a door. A door that someone had not opened, but sealed. Bricked over. Hidden away behind the broken bar of a forgotten saloon, in a building the whole town had agreed to forget. She did not break through it that night. The thing was too large to rush at. The meaning of it pressed down on her too hard. She needed to sit with it, to let it grow real and steady before she did the thing she already knew she was going to do. She lay down on her bedroll, but sleep was a long time coming. The wall stood at her back in the dark, and she felt it there the whole night through, like a held breath, like a closed mouth waiting to be made to speak. The next morning, she spent the last of her coins. She walked to the blacksmith's shop and bought a heavy sledgehammer and a cold chisel. The big man who sold them to her, his face and arms streaked with soot, gave her a long and curious look as he took her coins. "Tearing something down?" he asked, "or building something up?" Della weighed the hammer in her two hands. It was heavier than she had thought, heavy enough to frighten her a little. "A bit of both," she said. "I think." She carried it back to the building, and she stood before the wall a long while. This was the point past which there would be no turning back. Whatever lay behind that brick, someone had wanted it gone, hidden, forgotten, walled up in the dark, away from any eye that might look upon it and understand. And the marshal's voice came to her again, soft and warm, and full of its quiet threat. "There is nothing for you in there." Had he known? Was this the nothing he had been so very eager for her to ignore? Della drew a long breath. She set her feet. She raised the sledgehammer, and she swung. The first blow was clumsy. It struck the mortar with a jarring crack and sent a puff of pale dust up into the lantern light. The brick held. She swung again, harder this time. She put her shoulders into it, her back, and then, without quite meaning to, she put more than that. She put a year of being looked at like bad weather, and 5 years of grief carried in and out with every breath, and a lifetime of taking the road when she would rather have stayed. The hammer struck true. A spider web of cracks ran out across the face of the brick. The third blow shattered it, and behind it, not earth, not stone, not the solid backing a wall is meant to have. Behind it was darkness. A pocket of stale, trapped air sighed out through the broken brick, and it carried a smell with it, faint, dry, the smell of old paper and aged leather. The smell of a room shut up tight against the passing of years. Della's heart hammered against her ribs. She had been right. There was a room. She set the sledge aside and took up the chisel and the smaller hammer. And now she worked with care, loosening the mortar, drawing the bricks free one at a time, and setting each one down on the floor beside her. The work was slow, painstaking. The dust filled the air and coated her face and her hair and the back of her throat. She lost track of time. The light moved across the boarded windows in thin gold lines and then began to fade, and still she worked until the opening was at last wide enough for a slim girl to pass through. She lifted her lantern and she held it through the gap, and she leaned her head in after it. It was a small room, no bigger than a pantry, windowless, sealed, and it had been someone's office. A plain desk stood against the far wall, with a single wooden chair drawn up to it. A small iron box of a safe sat tucked into one corner, and papers everywhere, stacked upon the desk, spilling from drawers that had been left half open, scattered across the floor, as though someone had been through them in a great and final hurry, and then had run out of time. It was a moment caught and held, a held breath from years gone by, sealed up behind brick and left to wait in the dark. Della drew a breath, and she climbed through the gap, and her boots came down soft on the dusty floor of a room no living soul had stood in for 5 long years. She raised the lantern high, and its light fell across a book lying open upon the desk. She stepped closer. Her eyes moved over the page. Columns, neat columns, in a careful hand. Names down one side, figures down the other, dates between. She did not know all the names, but she knew some of them. The names of men she had heard spoken in low voices in the 2 days she had walked the town. Men with money in their pockets and the big outfit at their backs. And there, near the bottom of the page, the largest figure of them all, sat beside a name she had come to know very well. Brennan. Her hand began, very slightly, to shake. This was a record of money passing hands in the dark. Payments, the kind a man makes when he wishes a thing done and wishes no questions asked about the doing of it. She turned the page. Tucked into the fold of the book was a small sheaf of letters, written in a cramped and angry hand. She lifted the topmost one. She held it close to the lantern, and she began to read. The words swam up out of the dark at her one by one. She did not take them all in at once. The mind has its own mercy, and it lets in such things slowly. But the shape of it came clear soon enough. There had been a claim, a small one, a patch of ground worked by 2 partners, a thing of no great account, until it proved to hold far more than anyone had dreamed, far more than 2 plain men working with their hands had any right to find. And once it did, others wanted it, powerful others. Men who did not dig in the dirt themselves, but who knew how to take what other men had dug. And there had been an arrangement, a foul one, to make the 2 partners disappear, and the claim along with them, and to let the whole thing be written off as bad luck and falling stone. A cave-in, the cleanest way, one line said, in that cramped and ugly hand. The cleanest way. No questions asked. The lantern shook so hard in Della's grip that the shadows danced wild across the walls. One of those 2 partners, one of those 2 plain men who had worked the ground with their hands, was named Hart. The breath went out of her all at once as though she had been struck. It was not a cave-in. It was not an accident. Not bad luck, not falling stone. It was murder. Her father had not been taken by the careless earth. He had been taken by men, men with soft voices and money in their pockets, men who had wanted what he had found, and had decided that the simplest way to have it was to make sure he was no longer there to keep it. Della sank down into the dusty chair, the letter shaking in her hand, her eyes blurring over so that the angry words ran together and lost their shape. They had not merely killed him. They had erased him, turned his death into an accident, turned his life's work into someone else's good fortune. They had taken his claim and his future, and the home he had promised her in a letter she still carried folded in her bag. And they had left a young girl an orphan, penniless and alone on the road, while they grew fat on the thing her father had found with his own 2 hands. And some of these papers, she would come to understand much later, had not belonged to this room at all. They had been carried here, swept up and hidden away, the way a careless thief hides a thing he does not yet know the true worth of. But that understanding was for another day, for now there was only the grief, and the whole town had let it stand, some of them through corruption, most of them, perhaps, only through the easy blindness of folks who would rather not know. The grief came over her like a wave, fresh, brutal, as though she were losing him all over again for the first time in the dark of a sealed room. But beneath the grief, slow and cold and hard as the iron safe in the corner, something else began to form. It was not despair. It was the opposite of despair. It was a clear and steady anger, the kind that does not burn hot and fast and burn itself out, but settles deep and holds and waits. She did not know yet what she would do. She only knew that she could no longer walk away. The building had stopped being a shelter the moment she understood what it held. It had become a tomb, her father's tomb in a manner of speaking, for it held the truth of his ending where the cold ground out past the town held only his bones. And she had just unsealed it. How long she sat there in the dark, she could not have said. Long enough for the lantern to burn low, long enough for the cold of the windowless room to seep up through the floor and into her. And then a sound reached her, soft, from the broken gap in the wall behind her. A footstep. Della came up out of the chair fast, the letter clutched against her chest, her heart slamming. But it was not the marshal who stood in the gap. It was the old woman, Hazel. She stood there in the broken opening, the lantern light falling across the deep lines of her face, and she did not look surprised. She did not look frightened. She looked at Della, and then she looked slowly around the little sealed room, the desk, the safe, the scattered papers, and something in her old face seemed to settle, to loosen, as though a thing she had carried a long while had at last been set down. "So," she said softly, "you found it." Della could not speak. The old woman stepped through the gap, careful of the broken brick, and stood in the small room as though she had stood in it before, in some other life. "He came to me," Hazel said. Her voice was low and even, and there was a sorrow in it now that she did not try to hide. "Your father. Before the end." He had a worried look about him. He had begun to understand what he was sitting on, and to understand that there were men who would not let him keep it. She looked at the letter in Della's shaking hands. "He did not tell me everything. A careful man, your father. He wished to keep me clear of it, I think, but he told me enough to be afraid for him." Her old eyes glistened in the low light. "And I tried to warn him, to tell him to walk away from that ground, rich as it was, to take his girl and go somewhere far and start again with nothing, and call himself lucky for the having of his life." Her voice caught, just slightly. He would not hear it. He said the ground was honest, even if men were not. He said a person should not have to run from what is rightfully his. She shook her head slowly. He believed in that, right to the end. Della found her voice at last. It came out small and cracked and very young. "You knew," she whispered. "All this time, you knew what happened to him." "I suspected," the old woman said gently. "I never had the proof of it. No paper, no book of names, only the word of a worried man and the silence that came after." She glanced again at the sealed walls around them. "I knew this room was here. I knew, near enough, what it held." But I am an old woman that this town stopped seeing a long while ago. What was I to do? Take a hammer to a wall the marshal himself had ordered shut? They would have buried me beside whatever lay behind it. She reached out, then, and laid one gnarled hand lightly over Della's, over the letter, over the trembling. So I waited, she said simply. 5 years, I waited, for someone to come along who was stubborn enough to buy a thing no one wanted, and brave enough to take it apart with her own 2 hands, and care enough to want to know why. Her dark eyes held Della's. And here you are. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The lantern burned low between them, and the dust hung in the still air, and the truth lay scattered all around them on the floor of a room that had kept its silence for 5 long years. Then Hazel drew back her hand, and she stepped away toward the broken gap in the wall, as though she meant to give the girl room, as though, having said her piece, she understood that the rest of it, whatever the rest of it would be, did not belong to her. It belonged to the daughter. What happens now, the old woman said, pausing at the gap, is not for me to say. I am old, and I have had my part in this, small as it was. She looked back, and in the low light her lined face was kind and grave and certain. But know this, what was done in the dark wishes to stay in the dark, and there are men in this town who will fight hard to keep it there. She stepped through the broken wall, and at the last, before the shadows took her, her voice came soft out of the dimness. You are your father's daughter, stubborn, honest. A pause. Be careful, child, that it does not cost you what it cost him. Then she was gone, and Della Hart was alone again, in the sealed and broken room, with the lantern guttering low, and the truth of her father's death held tight against her heart, and a long, hard road rising up before her in the dark that she could not yet see the end of. But she knew now, with a certainty that had settled into her very bones, that she was going to walk it. The storm came down out of the hills that evening, the way trouble often comes. Slowly at first, and then all at once. Della felt it before she saw it, a change in the air, a restless, charged feeling that set the loose boards of the old building creaking and made the dust devils spin and stagger up and down the empty street. The light went strange and yellow-gray, the color of an old bruise, and the wind began to lean against the walls with a low and steady moan. Inside the sealed room, by the light of her guttering lantern, Della worked. She gathered the papers one by one, the book of names, the angry letters. She made of them a careful stack, and she wrapped that stack in a square of oilcloth she had found in a back closet, and she bound it tight with twine, the way her father had once shown her to bundle things that mattered against the rain. Then she turned to the small iron safe in the corner. She had left it for last. The breaking of the wall had taken everything she had, and there had been the grief, and then the old woman. But now, with the storm rising at her back, she knelt before the little iron box and set her hands upon it. It was locked, of course. She sat back on her heels and thought. A careful man, Hazel had called her father, and the man who had kept this room had been careful too, in his own crooked way. Careful men hide things, but careful men also need to find the things they hide, in a hurry, in the dark, and so they leave themselves a way back in, a small key, a number written somewhere it would not be looked for. She searched the desk. She ran her fingers along the undersides of the drawers. She turned over the ink pot, the blotter, a cracked cup that held a few dry pens, and then her eye fell on a single book, set apart from the scattered papers, standing upright against the wall of the desk. She drew it out. She turned it in her hands, and there, scratched faint into the leather of its spine, so small a person would pass it by 100 times, was a row of numbers. Her breath came quick. She knelt again before the safe, and she worked the dial by the numbers on the spine, slow and careful, her ear close to the cold iron. The last tumbler fell with a soft and final click. The door swung open. Inside lay money, folded papers that promised gold, stacked neat and deep. More money than Della had seen gathered in one place in the whole of her young life. But it was not the money that stopped her breath. It was the document folded behind it. She drew it out with shaking fingers and held it to the lantern. It was a deed, a transfer of the claim, her father's claim, the ground he had worked with his own 2 hands, signed over, whole and entire, to the big outfit that sat over the valley. And it was dated 2 days after her father went into the ground, 2 days after the falling stone the whole town had called an accident. A dead man cannot sign away his land. And so someone had signed it for him. Della stared at the name written at the bottom in her father's place. It was meant to be his hand. It was made to look like his hand. But she knew her father's hand the way she knew the carving on the floor by the door. The straight, patient strokes, the particular care of it. And this was not it. This was a forgery, a clumsy lie set down in ink to steal a dead man's ground while the dirt was still fresh over him. She knelt there in the sealed room with the storm howling against the walls, the forged deed in one hand and the bundle of truth at her side, and the cold thing in her chest grew colder still and harder and more certain. They had killed him. They had robbed him. And then they had reached down and signed his own name to the robbery, as though he had handed them his life's work with a smile before he died. It was almost too much to hold. And then, over the moan of the wind and the first hard drops beginning to strike the roof, came a pounding at the front door. Della froze. Her heart leapt up into her throat. Had the marshal come back? Had he somehow known, the way men like that seem to know, the moment a hidden thing is brought up into the light? The pounding came again, frantic, and with it a voice, thin and high and ragged with fear. A woman's voice. "Please, is anyone in there? Please. We need shelter. The storm. Please." Della crept to the broken gap in the wall and through the dark of the main room to the front, and she put her eye to a crack in the boarded door. There, huddled on the porch against the driving rain, was a small family. A man holding his hat down against the wind, a woman beside him, one hand pressed to the round swell of her belly, soaked through and shivering, and between them, half hidden in the woman's skirts, a small child with wide and frightened eyes. Their wagon stood in the street behind them, the horses tossing their heads and stamping in the rising storm. "The storm came up so fast," the man called through the door, his voice near torn away by the wind. "Every other place is shut up tight. Please, miss, if there is anyone, we only need to wait it out. We will not be any trouble. Please." Della stood very still behind the door, To open it was to give herself away, to let it be known that the building was lived in, that the girl who had bought it for $2 was inside and had not heeded the marshal's warning, and had been busy in the dark. But to leave them out there, a woman in that condition, a small child, in a storm like this one, that was a thing she could not do. It was a thing her father would not have done. She thought of him then, of his quiet kindness, of the way he had always made room, and she lifted the bar from the door and drew it open against the wind. "Come in," she said, quickly, out of the wet. They stumbled inside, gasping and grateful, and she barred the door again behind them. The woman clutched at her arm with a cold and trembling hand. "Bless you," she breathed. "Bless you, miss. We are only passing through, heading west to start fresh. We did not mean to trouble you." "It is no trouble," Della said, and she meant it. She found them a dry corner. She gave the child a biscuit from her own thin store and a sip from her canteen, and the little one took it solemnly, with wide eyes that moved around the ruined room and back to her face. The storm beat down upon the roof like 1,000 drumming fingers, and then the front door was thrown open with a bang. The wind came howling in, and the rain with it, and there in the doorway, rain plastering his hair to his forehead, his face a mask of black thunder, stood the marshal, Brennan. He was not looking at the frightened family in the corner. His eyes had gone straight past them, straight to the back of the room, to the broken gap in the brick wall, and the loose bricks scattered on the floor, and the faint glow of lantern light leaking out of the sealed room beyond. He knew. Della saw the understanding land in his face, saw it harden there. "I warned you," he said. His voice had lost its warmth. There was nothing soft left in it now. He stepped inside, dripping, and his hand came to rest on the butt of the pistol at his hip. "I told you to leave this place alone. I told you there was nothing in here for you." The family shrank back into their corner. The woman pulled the child against her, and Della, small, soaked, 19 years old, and weighing nothing against a grown man with a gun, stepped forward. She put herself between the marshal and the broken wall, between him and the room, between him and the bundle of truth that lay wrapped in oilcloth just out of sight. "This is my property, Marshal," she said. Her voice shook. She could not stop it from shaking, but it did not break, and it did not back down. "You are the one trespassing here." The marshal laughed, a harsh and ugly sound, swallowed up by a clap of thunder that shook the old building to its bones. "Your property?" He took a step closer, and his eyes glinted hard in the low light. "You own nothing, girl. The man who hid in that room owned nothing. It belongs to the outfit. It belongs where it has always belonged." Another step. "Now, you are going to be a sensible girl, and you are going to hand over whatever you found back there. And then we can forget this whole sorry business. You can walk away from here. You can keep on walking and live a long life doing it." The threat lay plain beneath the words. Hand it over and live. The wind shrieked. The rain came down in sheets against the windows. And here, Della understood, was the moment. She could give him the papers. She could save herself. She could let her father's name stay a lie, carved into a forged deed, and let his death stay an accident, and let the men who had done it grow old and fat and untroubled. She could take the long life he was offering, and spend it knowing she had handed them the truth to bury all over again, or she could refuse. She thought of the initials cut into the floor by the door. She thought of a quiet man on a borrowed step, carving small things just to watch his daughter smile. She thought of a letter, folded soft at the bottom of her bag, full of a hope that men like this one had taken from the world. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it filled the whole of the room. The marshal's face went still, and then it went cold. He drew the pistol. "I will not ask a third time," he said. The little family pressed back hard against the wall. The child began softly to cry, and Della stood her ground, with nothing in her hands and nothing at her back but a broken wall and the truth behind it. And she looked down the length of that pistol, and she did not run. It would have been easy for him. A girl alone, a condemned building, a storm to cover the sound. But it was not a girl alone. Not anymore. There were witnesses now. A man, a woman heavy with child, a small frightened child of their own. Folk passing through, who would carry the tale of this night down every road they traveled west. To shoot her here, in front of all their watching eyes, was a thing even a man with a badge could not so easily wave away. Della saw the calculation move behind his hard eyes, saw the fury war with the cold arithmetic of it, and in that frozen moment, the side door that gave onto the alley swung open. The wind drove it wide, and there, framed in the dark of the doorway, soaked to the bone and steady as old stone, stood the old woman, Hazel. She held a long-barreled shotgun across her thin arms, and she held it as though she had held one before, and knew its weight, and was not troubled by it. "I believe," Hazel said in that low and even voice that carried even over the storm, "that it is time you were on your way, Marshal." Her dark eyes did not waver. "The girl has guests tonight, and the night is no longer young." The marshal stood caught, his fury and the long barrel of the shotgun and the 4 pairs of watching eyes. They pressed in on him from every side, and there was no soft road left for him to take. To do murder now, before so many witnesses, was a thing that even his badge could not cover. He looked at Della a long moment, and in his eyes was a promise of patience. A promise that this was not finished, that a man like him had other ways, and quieter nights, and longer memories. "This is not over," he said softly. Then he turned, and he strode out into the screaming storm, and he slammed the door behind him so hard the broken glass of the old mirror chimed in its frame. The crisis had passed. But Della knew, standing there with her heart slamming and her knees gone weak beneath her, that the true storm had only begun. She had survived the night. Now she had to win the war. The storm broke before dawn. It moved off east over the hills, and it left the air washed clean and cool, and the morning came up pale and quiet, as though the whole world were holding its breath. The little family did not stay long. Their fear had given way to a quiet awe, and the woman pressed Della's hands between her own cold ones at the door and looked at her with eyes gone soft. "We will tell folk what we saw," she said, "wherever we go. We will tell them about the girl who stood up to that man with nothing in her hands at all." Then they were gone, their wagon rolling west into the thin gold light, carrying the story with them. And Della was alone again, but for the old woman who lingered in the doorway, the shotgun now lowered and resting in the crook of her arm. Hazel looked at the girl. She looked at the bundle of oilcloth that Della had brought out from the sealed room and now held clutched against her chest. "You cannot stay here," the old woman said gently. "You know that." Della knew it. The marshal was a man humbled now, in front of witnesses, and a humbled man of that kind grows more dangerous, not less. He would not risk another open confrontation. But there were other ways: a fire in the night, an accident on a dark road, things that a man like that knew how to arrange, and arrange quietly. "Then I will take it where it has to go," Della said, "to someone with the power to act on it, someone above him." Hazel was quiet a moment. "There is a man," she said at last, "a man who holds authority over this whole stretch of country. He sits in judgment when the law is called upon. Folks say he is hard. Folks say he is fair." A pause. "Folks say a great many things, but he is above the marshal, and he is the nearest thing to a higher law that this country has." Della nodded slowly. "Then that is where I will go." The old woman studied her a long while. There was worry in her lined face, deep and plain. "Be careful, child," she said softly. "The roots of a thing like this run deeper than they look. You have pulled up one weed. You do not yet know how far the rot has spread beneath." But Della had made up her mind. She wrapped the bundle tight. She gathered what little she owned, and before the town had fully woken, she set out, alone, on foot at first, and then on a borrowed mule that Hazel pressed upon her without a word, down the long road that led toward the seat of the higher law. The journey was a tense and watchful thing. Every rider on the far horizon made her pulse quicken. Every shadow shifting in the brush along the road seemed for a moment to wear the marshal's shape. She slept little and lightly, with the bundle of truth held against her like a child, and she watched the road behind her as much as the road ahead. But she made it. She came at last to the place where the higher law kept its house, a grander building than any in her own forgotten town, with tall windows and a look of solid permanence about it, the kind of place built to make a person feel small. She was made to wait. A clerk tried to turn her away. But Della had learned in her short and difficult life that a quiet refusal to leave is its own kind of power. She gave the marshal's name. She gave the name of the big outfit. And at last, worn down by her steady, unmoving patience, the clerk showed her in. The man of the higher law was seated behind a wide and heavy desk. He was older, gray at the temples. He had the still, watchful face of a man well used to weighing other men, and finding most of them wanting. He looked at the thin, road-worn girl before him, and he did not smile, and he did not frown. He simply waited. So Della told him. She did not weep. She did not plead. She had learned that the truth speaks loudest when it is spoken plainly. So she laid it out, piece by piece, in a clear and steady voice. The carved initials, the wrong-colored wall, the hollow sound, the sealed room, the book of names, the angry letters, the cleanest way, no questions asked. And then she set the forged deed down upon his desk, last of all. A dead man's land, signed away 2 days after the falling stone. The man of the higher law picked up the deed. He read it once. He read it again. He held it to the light from the tall window, studying the signature, the seal, the date. And Della, watching his still face, felt the first true flicker of hope she had allowed herself in a long while. Here, at last, was a man above the marshal, A man with the power to set it right. A man who would look at the proof of murder and theft laid out before him and would act. The man of the higher law set the deed down. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, in a calm and pleasant voice, "Where did you say you found these papers, exactly?" Something in the way he said it made the hope go cold in her chest. It was not the question of a man moved by what he had read. It was the question of a man taking careful measure of a problem. He had not asked who killed her father. He had not asked after the names in the book. He had asked where the papers came from, how many there were, whether she had shown them to anyone else. He was not weighing a crime. He was weighing her. Della rose slowly from her chair. "I think," she said carefully, reaching to gather the papers back toward her, "that I have taken enough of your time." But his hand came down upon the bundle, flat, heavy, pinning it to the desk. "Now there is no need to rush off," he said, and the pleasantness in his voice had gone thin and hard at the edges. "These are serious matters, grave accusations against important men. It would not do for them to fall into the wrong hands. Best you leave it all here with me, where it can be looked after properly." And in that moment, Della understood. The roots run deeper than they look. This man, this higher law, this last and best hope above the corrupt marshal, was no higher law at all. He was a part of it, a larger part, sitting in a grander chair. The book of names had not held only the small men of one forgotten town. It had reached up. It had reached here. She had walked the proof of the whole rotten thing straight into the hands of one of its keepers. Her mind moved fast, faster than her fear. She let her shoulders drop. She let her face go soft and tired and beaten, the very picture of a young girl who knows she has lost. "Of course," she said quietly. "You are right, sir. I am only tired. I do not know what I was thinking." The man's hard eyes softened, just slightly. He had seen this before, no doubt. A girl giving up. A problem solving itself. His hand eased on the bundle, and in that small half moment, Della snatched it up and turned and ran. She heard him shout behind her, heard the scrape of his chair, the bark of a name, a clerk's startled voice. But she was already through the door, already down the long hall, already out into the bright and busy street, where a running girl was just one more body in the crowd. She did not stop. She lost herself among wagons and storefronts and the press of people. She doubled back and turned again, the bundle of truth clutched to her chest, her breath sawing in her throat, until the grand building with its tall windows was far behind her. She did not stop until full dark. She hid that night in a dry wash beyond the edge of the settlement, beneath an overhang of rock, with the borrowed mule tethered close and her heart still hammering long after the running was done. She had been so close. She had believed for the space of a few breaths that she had found the door that would open, the man who would set it right. And it had been one more sealed room, one more wall built to keep the truth down in the dark. The despair of it pressed on her in the cold night, heavy and complete. But Della Hart had learned a thing or two about despair. She had learned that it is a liar, that it tells a person the door they just found is the last door, that the wall they just struck is the edge of the world, and she had learned from a quiet man who read stories in stone to keep looking for the seam. So when her breath had steadied and the night had gone quiet around her, she drew the bundle into her lap by the thin light of a half moon, and she went through it all again, slowly, looking this time not at what she already understood, but at what she had passed over. And she found it in the deed, the forged deed, the one she had looked at a dozen times. She had been so fixed on the false signature in her father's place that she had scarcely looked at the rest of the page, at the bottom, at the witnessing mark, at the seal pressed into the wax beside it, the mark of the one whose word had made the whole foul transfer law. She held it close to the moonlight, and she turned it to the silver of it, and she read the name set beneath that seal, and the breath left her body. It was a name she knew, a name spoken in that forgotten town with respect and warmth and even a kind of love. The name of the man who had founded the place, the man whose money had built its first streets, whose name was carved over its proudest doorway, whose face folk spoke of as a father to them all, the man everyone trusted, the man no one would believe a word against. He was not a bystander to this. He was not a small name in a book. He was its root. The marshal, for all his swagger and his pistol, was only an arm, a blunt instrument that did the close, ugly work. And the man of the higher law, in his grand chair, was only a hand reaching up from the same dark place. But the founder was the will behind them both. It had been his design from the start. The claim, the falling stone, the forged name, the sealed room. All of it had flowed down from a man the whole country called good, a man who smiled and shook hands and let lesser men do his killing while he kept his own hands clean and his own name bright. Della sat very still beneath the overhang of rock, the deed trembling in her grip, the cold truth of it settling over her like the night itself. This was so much larger than one corrupt marshal in one forgotten town. She was a girl of 19, alone in a dry wash with a borrowed mule and a bundle of papers, standing against a man so powerful that the law itself bent its knee to him. And in that moment, the fear came near to swallowing her whole. She thought of turning back, of laying the bundle in the dirt and walking away west, the way the little family had gone, of taking the long life the marshal had offered, and trying somehow to forget. But then she thought of her father. She thought of his quiet voice. A person should not have to run from what is rightfully his. He had not run. It had cost him everything, but he had not run. And she found, sitting there in the cold and the dark with the whole weight of it pressing down on her, that she was, after all, her father's daughter. Stubborn, honest, unwilling to lay the truth back down in the dark, now that she had carried it this far. If the higher law in this stretch of country was rotten, then she would carry it past this stretch of country, farther than the founder's name was known, farther than his money reached, out to where a person could stand before a law so distant and so cold that even a great man's good name could not buy its silence. It would be a long road, a hard road, a dangerous one, with the marshal at her back and the founder's reach spread wide before her. But Della Hart drew the bundle of truth tight against her chest, and she lay back against the cold stone, and she watched the half moon ride the dark sky, and somewhere beneath her fear, steady and cold and certain as the carving on a saloon floor. Her resolve had already chosen the road. She would walk it, however far it ran. The road that lay before her now was longer than any road she had walked in the whole of her young life. It ran out past the reach of the founder's name, past the country where his money had laid the streets and bought the silence and the soft, looking away kindness of folk who would rather not know. It ran on toward a place so far that a great man's good standing weighed little there, a place where the law was a cold and distant thing, slow to wake, but hard, very hard, to bend. Della Hart walked it, the bundle of truth held against her chest, the borrowed mule plodding patient at her side, its breath fogging in the cold of the early mornings, and her father's quiet voice keeping her company across the empty miles, the way a remembered voice will when a person has carried it long enough. A man should not have to run from what is rightfully his. He had said that. She held to it now the way a traveler holds to a lantern in the dark. She slept rough in dry washes and under overhangs of stone. She ate little and carefully, making her small store last. She kept off the main roads where she was able, and she watched the horizon at her back as much as the one ahead. More than once, the shape of a far-off rider sent her down off the trail and into the brush, her heart slamming until the shape passed by and proved to be nothing more than a stranger about his own business. But she noticed something as the miles fell away behind her. The marshal's reach grew thinner the farther she went, and the founder's name, that name spoken with such love and such reverence back in the forgotten town, as though the man who wore it were a father to them all, drew only blank looks from the stranger she passed. Out here, he was a father to no one. He was a name and nothing more. And a name, she was learning, can be questioned. That gave her a strange new courage. The understanding that power has edges, that it does not stretch out endless in every direction, however endless it may feel to the small folk who live their whole lives in its shadow. There was a world beyond the founder's reach. There were places his long arm could not follow. She only had to walk far enough to find one. So she walked. And at last she came to the place where the far law kept its seat. It was a grave and solid building, older than anything in her own town, with a look of permanence about it that seemed to say it had stood before such men as the founder were born, and would stand long after they were forgotten. She was made to wait, of course. She was always made to wait. A road-worn girl with a bundle of papers is not a thing the world hurries to attend. But Della had a patience in her now that ran deeper than her weariness, deeper than her fear. She had carried the truth too far, through too much, to be turned aside at the final door. So she waited, through one long day and into another. And when at last she was shown in, she found herself standing before a man who was, she would come to understand, a wholly different kind of man from any she had met on this hard road. He was lean and gray and stern. His eyes had a way of resting upon a person that seemed to see clear through to whatever lay beneath the skin of them. He had a name in that country, this man. Folks said he could not be bought, could not be frightened, could not be moved by anything at all save the plain, hard weight of what was true. Folks say a great many things, but this once, Della would find, they had said it right. He listened to her without a single word of interruption. She told it as she had learned to tell it across all those miles of rehearsing it to the empty sky, plainly, in its proper order. Without weeping, though the tears pressed hot behind her eyes the whole while, without pleading, though her whole heart was one long plea, the carved letters by the door, the patch of wall whose brick was wrong, the hollow sound beneath her knuckles, the sealed room, the held breath of trapped and ancient air that had sighed out at her when the brick first broke, the book of names, the angry letters in their cramped and ugly hand, the cleanest way, no questions asked. And then she set the papers down before him, one at a time, the way a person lays down cards she has been holding far too long, the forged deed last of all. A dead man's land, signed over in a hand that was not his. 2 days after the falling stone, the whole world had agreed to call an accident. The stern man took up the deed. He read it once. He read it through again. He turned it to the gray light from the tall window and studied the false signature, and then the seal pressed deep into the wax beside it, and the name set down beneath that seal, the founder's name, the man everyone trusted. He set the deed down upon the desk, and he was quiet a long while, his fingers steepled before his mouth, his sharp old eyes moving slow from the papers to the thin girl before him, and back again to the papers. "You understand," he said at last, "the weight of what you have set before me." "I think I do, sir. You are laying a charge against men of great standing, the lawman who keeps the peace in that country, the one who sits in judgment over the whole of it." His eyes lifted to hers. "And above them both, a man whose name, in his own town, is spoken near like a prayer." "Yes, sir." "And you understand that should these papers prove false, should you have walked all this long way to set a tale before me, it is your own neck the rope will fit, not theirs." "The papers are not false, sir." She met his hard gaze, and she held it. The way she had held the gaze of the smirking clerk at the land office, the way she had faced the marshal down the length of his pistol, the way she had stood under the cold, measuring stare of the man who had pinned her truth to his desk with one heavy hand. My father's hand is not a false thing. A daughter knows her father's hand among 1,000 others. And this, she laid one finger gently against the forged name, is not his hand. It was made to look like his, but it was set down by a stranger. Her voice did not waver. "A dead man cannot hold a pen, sir, and he was 2 days dead before this ink was ever dry." The stern man looked at her for a long, long while. And then something shifted in his weathered face, not softness. He was not a soft man, and she did not need him to be. It was something better than softness. It was a grave and quiet respect, settling over his features the way the first thin light of dawn settles over a hard land, slow and cold and certain. "No," he said quietly. "I do not believe you have come here to spin a tale." He gathered the papers together with careful hands, as a man gathers something he understands to be precious. "It will take time," he said. "These things move slowly, and they are built to. A great name does not come down in a day, nor should it. There will be men sent quietly to that country. There will be questions asked that have gone unasked for years. There will be a reckoning, but a slow one, and a thorough one, so that it holds, so that no clever tongue can unpick it later and set those men free to do it all again to some other family. He looked up at her. You have carried this a long way, girl, farther than most grown men would have found the spine to carry it. The carrying is done now. His voice gentled just slightly. Set it down. Let it pass into other hands. You have earned the rest. And Della Hart, who had held the truth against her chest through storm and flight and the cold of a dozen sleepless nights, felt it lifted from her at last. It is a strange thing to lay down a weight a person has carried so long that it has worn itself into the very shape of her. For a moment she felt almost hollow without it, almost lost, the way a hand feels lost when it sets down a thing it has gripped too long and does not yet know what to do with itself. And then she felt the other thing. She felt light. The reckoning came, as the stern man had promised it would, slowly, thoroughly, in its own time, by its own quiet roads. Word of such matters travels strangely. It came back to the forgotten town in pieces and in whispers long before it came all at once. Folk would speak of a thing half heard. A rumor would die and rise again, and die and rise. And then, all at once, it was no longer rumor. Men arrived in the town who answered to no one in that country. They had no friends there to please, and no enemies there to fear. They asked their hard questions in their flat, untroubled voices. They opened doors that had been kept shut for years. They looked, patiently and without flinching, into matters that the whole town had long ago learned to look away from. The marshal was the first to fall, a man whose every ounce of power had rested upon the certainty that no one above him would ever call him to account, and who learned too late and to his ruin that the certainty had been a lie all along. The swagger went out of him. The big, easy laugh fell silent. He went quiet and gray and small when the men who answered to no one came at last to take him away. The one who had sat in judgment, with his grand wide desk and his tall windows and his pleasant measuring voice, fell next. The hand that had come down so heavy upon a girl's bundle of papers could not hold back what was rolling toward him now. And then the founder, the man whose name was carved over the proudest doorway in the town. The man folk spoke of as a father to them all. His name came down from over that doorway. It came down the way a great old tree comes down, groaning, resisting, and then, all at once, with a sound the whole town seemed to feel inside its chest. For when the truth of him became plain, the town that had loved him did not rush to throw itself in front of his fall. Folk are slow, very slow, to believe ill of a man they have trusted with their hearts. But once the believing finally comes, it comes hard, and it comes complete. And there had been too many quiet sorrows in that town, too many claims gone wrong. Too many good men lost to bad luck that, looked at squarely, had never quite added up. Too many of them, all told, for one great man's bright name to outshine. Once a thin girl of 19 had shown the wider country where to point its lantern. The claim came back, her father's claim, the ground he had worked with his own 2 hands, the ground he had loved and trusted and died still holding. It was taken back from the hands that had stolen it over his fresh grave, and it was returned to the one person left in all the world with the right to it, his daughter, his heir. Della Hart, who had come to that town with a single carpet bag and $2 silver, found herself, by a turning of the world she could scarcely take into her mind, no longer poor. But it was not the gold that moved her. It was never going to be the gold. It was something she found among the papers, when at last they were given back to her, the slow grinding work of the far law being done with them. Something she had passed over, in all the rush and the fear and the cold of that night in the dry wash. A letter. Not one of the angry ones in that cramped and ugly hand she had come to know. This was a different hand entirely. A patient hand. A careful hand. A hand she knew the way she knew the rhythm of her own heart in the dark. Her father's hand. It had been folded small and tucked away among the other papers in the sealed room, as though it had lain there waiting in the dark for 5 long years, waiting for the one soul it was meant for to come and break down the wall with her own 2 hands and find it. She carried it out of doors into the clean and open light where she could see it true. And there, standing in the morning, she read it. It was not a long letter. Her father had been a man of few words, and most of those plain ones. But the plain words went into her like light pouring into a long dark room. He wrote of the claim and the good fortune of it, and the worry that had begun to trail that good fortune around like a shadow underfoot. He wrote that there were men who wanted what he had found, and that he did not fully trust them, and that he was setting down, here, just in case, the things a man ought not to keep only inside his own head. And then he wrote of her. He wrote that the gold meant nothing to him in itself, nothing at all, save for the one thing it could buy, and what he meant to buy with it, what he had set his heart upon, what he had been quietly and carefully arranging in the last weeks before the falling stone, was a home, a real place, he wrote. The very words from the soft, worn letter she had carried at the bottom of her bag through every mile of every road. A real place. A home. A place where no man could ever again turn his girl out into the road like something unwanted. And then she came to the line that stopped her breath in her chest. He had found the place, he wrote. He had set his eye on a building at the quiet edge of a small town. A poor thing, he admitted, and she could near hear the rueful smile in the writing of it. A rough place, run as a saloon by a man who had grown weary of it. A man willing, for the right price, to sign it over and walk away. Her father had been setting that price aside, quietly, coin by coin, from the claim. He had struck a bargain with the owner, and on the slow evenings when the saloon stood empty, the man would let him in to sit alone in the dust, and dream of the day he would tear out the bar and let the light back in and bring his daughter through the door to say to her, "This is yours. This cannot be taken from you. This is home." He had cut their mark into the wood by the door. A promise, set down even before the deed was drawn, so that the place would carry the name of his family from the very start. S. H. Della stood in the clean light with the letter trembling in her 2 hands, and the whole of it came together inside her chest at last, like a key, long lost, turning at last in a lock that had waited 5 silent years to feel it. The carved letters by the door. She had not stumbled by blind chance into some dead stranger's ruin. She had walked, grieving and penniless, and led by nothing she could put a name to, straight into the home her own father had died trying to build for her. She had bought it for $2 and the laughter of a whole town. And it had been, the entire while, the thing he had loved her enough to dream of, the place he had carved their name into, the place he had meant, with his whole quiet heart, to give to her. She understood the rest of it now too, standing there in the morning light. When they killed her father, they had swept up his papers along with him. The claim, the original report, the letter he had been keeping for her. And they had buried it all in that same hidden room, beside the keeper's ledger of bribes. For the man who ran that saloon, who had taken her father's quiet money and made his quiet bargain, had been their bookkeeper all along. He had kept their dark accounts in his sealed back room, and when that man began, in time, to talk too much and to ask for too large a share, they had silenced him too, and they had bricked the room over the whole of it, and let the building rot, and never once troubled to learn that the poor sagging place they were leaving to ruin had been, for the space of one hopeful season, a dead man's gift to his only child. The truth they had walled up in the dark had been walled up inside the very house her father had raised out of love and hope for her. She wept then. She stood in the open light with the letter pressed to her face, and she wept for a long while. But they were not the tears she had wept in the sealed room. Those had been the tears of pure loss, sharp and tearing, the kind that take a piece of a person with them when they go. These were a gentler thing. These were the tears of a daughter who had felt lost a long, long time, and who had found, at the end of a hard and bitter road, that she had been wanted all along, that she had not been a thing the world threw away, that somewhere someone had loved her enough to build her a place in it, that she had, after all this wandering, been coming home. She went back to the town. It was a different town that received her now, or perhaps it was the very same town, only looking at her with different eyes. The folk who had once whispered behind their hands as she passed, who had named her a fool and given the old building a wide and fearful berth, and let her stand alone in the dark against a man with a gun, now nodded to her in the street. The bolder ones stopped to speak. There were questions in their faces, and there was shame, and there was a kind of wondering respect, as though they could scarce make themselves believe that the thin girl with the single carpet bag had been the one to bring the great names of that country crashing down. She was gentle with them. She might have been hard. She had earned the right to be hard, if any soul ever had. They had laughed at her. They had turned from her. They had looked away while a powerful man backed her into a corner. But Della had come to understand a few things in the sealed room and on the long road, and in the reading of her father's letter. A person's worth, she had come to see, is not a thing the crowd is given the power to decide. The town had judged her worthless, and judged the old building worthless, and judged her father's death a piece of bad luck not worth the questioning. The town had been wrong about every last part of it, and if the town's judgment had been worthless when it weighed against her, then its judgment was worth no more now that it had swung around to weigh in her favor. She would not live, and she would not die, by what the crowd happened to think of her. She had stopped doing that on the day she set $2 silver down upon a counter and bought the one thing nobody else would touch. So she was gentle with them, not because they had earned it, but because she had decided somewhere along that hard road, what kind of person she meant to be. And it was not the kind who pays cruelty back with cruelty. She set to work upon the building with the means that were hers now by right and by law. She might have torn the old place down to the dirt and raised something grand and new in its stead. She might have left the forgotten town altogether and gone off to a country where her name and her story were not known, and lived soft and easy for the rest of her days. She did neither of those things. She stayed, and she made the old place whole. She had the ruin cleared and the broken things carried gently away. She had the long bar of dark wood sanded down and brought back to a warm glow, not for the pouring of any whiskey, but because her father had loved good wood, and she found she could not bear to see a fine thing left in pieces. She had clear new glass set into the windows, so that the good morning light her father had written of came spilling once more across the swept floor. She mended the boards. She mended the walls. But one wall she left just as it was, the broken brick, the gap she had hammered through with her own 2 hands on the night she had learned the whole bitter truth. She did not seal it back up. She cleaned its rough edges, and she framed it neat and square, and she left the little sealed room standing open behind it, swept bare, empty, but for a single plain chair set in the middle of the floor. A stranger might ask her why she kept a broken wall when she had the means to make the whole place new and fine, and she would tell them, because a thing that was kept in the dark, she would say, deserves to be remembered in the light, because that wall was where the truth had been hidden away. And she would let it stand, just so, as a quiet reminder to any who walked past it, that hidden things do not stay hidden in the end, that the dark gives up its secrets sooner or later to anyone with the stubbornness to ask, and the patience to stay until the answer comes. She did not open it again as a saloon. The country had places enough already where men went to drink down their sorrows, and the old name on the faded sign, swinging from its single rusted hinge, belonged to a time best left behind, a time of card games and bad blood, and a man dying badly on a barroom floor. She took the old sign down with her own hands, and she made of the building something her father, she felt sure, would have understood the moment he set foot in it. She made it a place for those with nowhere else to go, travelers caught out by hard weather, the way that small, frightened family had been caught on the night of the great storm, folk passing through with empty pockets and a long road still rising ahead of them, souls who had been turned out into the cold, the way she herself had once been turned out, and who needed, more than they needed anything in the world, a door that would open to them instead of close. She set a long table down the middle of the main room, and she saw to it that there was always something hot waiting upon it. She kept rooms made up, plain and clean, for any who came in need of one, and she asked nothing at all in return, save that those who were able would carry the kindness onward down the road and hand it to the next weary soul who needed it. The folk of the town watched all this with a quiet wonder. Here was a girl who had been handed gold enough to live like a queen for the rest of her years, and who had chosen, instead, to pour it into a refuge for the very kind of people the town had once stepped around in the street, the kind of people the town had once looked upon, the way it had looked upon her, On the dusty day the coach left her standing all alone. Some of them came to understand, slowly, what it was she was doing. She was building, with her own 2 hands and her father's hard-won gold, the very thing the world had once refused to give her. She was making a place where a person's worth was not weighed by the coin in her purse, nor the name set down on her papers, nor the careless judgment of a crowd. A place where the cast out were not cast out. A place where the door opened. She was giving to strangers the same gift her father had dreamed of giving to her. A home. A place that could not be taken away. One evening, when the work was very near done, a girl came up the road. Della saw her from the doorway. A thin thing, dust on the hem of her dress, a single bundle clutched in both arms, looking up at the building with the wary, half-hopeful eyes of someone who has been turned away from a great many doors and has stopped expecting any of them to open. Della knew that look. She had worn it herself once, standing in the dust of this very street. She did not let the girl knock. She stepped out and down into the gentle dusk, and she said the words she herself had so longed to hear on the worst day of her life. "Come in," she said. "You look tired. There is a place for you here." And she watched the girl's face change, watched the wariness break apart, and something soft and disbelieving rise up underneath it. It was, Della thought, the finest thing her father's gold had ever bought. Later that same evening, the old woman came. Hazel walked in through the wide front door, into the warm light and the smell of new pine and good cooking, and she stood a long while just looking at what the broken old place had become. "He would know it," the old woman said at last, softly. "Your father. He could walk in this door, and he would know it for the very thing he set out to make." Della stood beside her, looking out over the long table and the warm, clear light, and the framed gap in the wall where the truth had once lain hidden in the dark. "He started it," she said quietly. "I only finished it." Hazel turned to her, and there was a thing in the old woman's deeply lined face that had not been there before. Through all the long days of their knowing one another, the waiting was gone out of it. The patient, watchful, 5-year waiting, and in its place had come a deep and settled peace. "You did a great deal more than finish it, child," she said. "He built a house. You made it a home." Her dark eyes were kind and certain. There is a difference between the two, and it is, near enough, the whole of the difference in this world. Then the old woman reached out and laid one gnarled hand against Della's cheek, the way a grandmother might. And she said nothing more, because there was nothing more that wanted saying. And after a while, having seen at last the thing she had waited so long and so patiently to see, she went out again into the soft and gathering dusk. Della stood alone in the doorway of the home her father had dreamed for her. The evening light lay gold across the quiet street. Folk passed by, and some of them nodded, and she nodded back. Somewhere down the way, a child laughed at something. The blacksmith's hammer had gone still for the day. She thought of the coach that had set her down in the dust, a thin girl with one bag and no place at all in the world. She thought of the laughter at the land office. $2. The biggest fool this side of the mountains. She thought of the carved letters by the door, and the wrong-colored brick, and the hollow sound, and the long, hard road that had run so much farther than she could ever have dreamed at the start of it. And she thought of her father, not as she had thought of him in the sealed room, with the grief fresh and tearing, but as she thought of him now, a quiet man who had loved his daughter enough to dream her a home, to die still holding fast to that dream, and to leave it waiting for her, there in the dark until the day she was ready to come and find it. She had come to that town looking for his ghost. She had found, instead, his love, cut into a doorway, folded into a letter, built into the very bones of a place that was hers now, and would be hers past any man's power to take it. A person's worth, she thought, is not weighed by the world. It is carried in the hearts that love her. And it is shown, plain as morning light, in the doors she chooses to open for others. And the truth, however deep it is buried, however long it is held down in the dark, deserves, in the end, to be carried up into the light. She had done both of those things now. She rested her hand against the door frame, where 2 rough letters were cut into the old wood. She traced them slowly with her fingertips, the way she had traced them on that first dark and frightening night, when the place had been nothing in the world but a ruin and a riddle. S.H. But they were not only her father's mark anymore. They were hers, too. The same letters, the same name, the home he had begun and she had finished. And as the last of the gold light faded gently from the quiet street, Della Hart turned and stepped back inside, into the warmth and the good, clean light. And she left the door standing open behind her, for whoever might need it next.